Okay, so for part 3 of this lecture, we're going to be exploring social change, the concept of masculinities, and of patriarchy. So first of all, let's think about the history and the evolution of gender, particularly in the Australian context. So we have thought about how gender socialization operates, and that you can see that it channels particular ways of being or the performance of particular roles and practices and particular kinds of jobs in society and also in the family. So in the past, this has meant that often, as this image shows, that women were just seen as natural, as a natural role as being in the domestic sphere, as a mother and as a housewife, as looking after the home in terms of the caring kind of role that they would play. And men were seen as taking up the role as the breadwinner. And that was reflected in the structures of work, around the structures of education as well. So these kinds of gender socialization processes were also reflected in the structures of wider society. But this has changed over time and may not so much be the case as it was in the past. And this is arguably connected to changes in the economy, changes in work, wider social changes, but also changes in education and so on. So let's look at that a little bit more, just to think about the reasons for these kinds of social changes around gender. So one reason might be that the structure of education has changed, and women have accessed education, and especially higher education, in greater numbers, particularly in countries like Australia, over the past decades. In fact, they're occupying undergraduate places, maybe in some degrees in higher numbers than male students in some cases. And there's a whole range of different reasons for that. That might be to do with a reflection of changes in the labor market, but it might also be in struggles for women's access to higher education more broadly, the creation of different kinds of access provision, and also feminist struggles for women's access to higher education as well. And also this is reflected in the evolving labor market, and that's trending more towards white-collar work, more and more towards work where you need to have some kind of qualification, and that might mean that you need to have further education or higher education and so on. So those kinds of changes in both education and work that mirror each other have helped to create change in gender, in the way that gender is structured. This is all interrelated, so this relates also to the expansion of the middle class. So the aspirations around social mobility, and that has driven the need for more income. So the kind of aspirations for particular kinds of ways of life, home ownership, for example, might be one of them, career progression and so on, has also meant that families rely increasingly on having two incomes rather than one income. And that's changed also in the kind of pay structure and the kind of structure more broadly around work, around the idea of permanent jobs, or the idea of jobs changing through life, and the kind of male breadwinner salary has changed. So all of these changes have affected the broader kind of gender change. And also, you know, as I've already said, that's connected to declining full-time work, increased casualization of work, again meaning that families often require two incomes rather than just one, as in the past. That's related again to the rising cost of living, the rising cost of housing, the rising cost of education. So in order to ensure that your children perhaps are set up to be able to access higher education. Again, two incomes are probably required to do so. And then other changes like access to women's health and reproductive health, access to birth control and family planning has made a big difference in terms of the changing kind of division of labor. And as I've already kind of referred to, feminism has had a huge change, that there has been a first wave, second wave, third wave feminism, and generations of struggle for change from different perspectives. So there's more than one kind of feminism, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But all of that kind of struggle and impact has created some changes in the gender division of labor. However, despite these changes, there are some things that remain unequal, as we probably are aware. So women's full-time wages are still only around 80% of men's wages for doing the same kind of work. Women still are concentrated in particular kinds of areas of work like sales, service, clerical sectors, nursing, teaching. And if we think about those kinds of work, we might see some of those aspects of gender stereotypes at play. So the idea that women are more naturally inclined to do particular kinds of work plays out in terms of the ways in which we make choices about what to study, what we should become, how we practice our gender, and the kinds of positions that we end up taking up in work, but also who is seen as the kind of, I suppose, legitimate employee in particular kinds of roles and so on. And also degree pathways. So these sectors are generally lower paid, the ones that are associated with women and femininity, and that has a history behind it. So, you know, a lot of it, like nursing and teaching, you now need to have a university degree for. Historically, you didn't access nursing and teaching through a university degree. And there's historical kind of residues that linger, as well as arguably the way that those are associated with women, that are, you know, the overall picture is that they are generally lower paid. And the sectors in which men are concentrated often have few or limited career opportunities. So, you know, there's a reason and a structure behind these gendered inequalities that with analysis and with those different ways of looking at it, we can begin to understand better. Further to that, very few women occupy senior leadership or managerial positions compared to men. So if you look in university, there are much fewer vice chancellors globally of universities, and in senior leadership positions, there's far fewer women in high-level political roles, less women in a whole range of key kind of influential roles, judges, CEOs, senior leaders, executive leaders, and so on. And interestingly, I think that this is a nice little image here. So the harder a wife works, the cuter she looks. So this comes back to our gender stereotyping again, which makes a difference. It actually makes a difference in terms of the representation of what is valuable in a personhood. And women are often, because of those stereotypes, are often, the representations are around appearance and fashion and, you know, questioning about what a woman wears and so on. Interestingly, compared to other countries that share similar levels of affluence and educational access and so on, Australia has a high level of gender segregation in both work and leisure. And that's a very interesting sociological question to think about. Well, why is that? What historical resonances have lingered and what has changed? This is perhaps one argument and one explanation that Australians tend to believe that this is just natural. And, you know, when visiting other countries might find that gender segregation is not as profound. That might be surprising. But it's also important to go back to that relationship between the different kinds of work that men and women might be concentrated in, have different kinds of social value, might be seen as valued differently. So, being a doctor or a nurse carries different kinds of values, and that's important in understanding gender inequalities. And it's interesting that although, as I said earlier, women have accessed higher education in increasing numbers and are really quite successful overall in terms of educational attainment, women often end up in jobs that are casualized, low paid, low status, and insecure. So again, a sociological question would be, why is that? Well, we have these patterns. How can we understand this? How can we explain this? And this partly might be explained in the fact that women often take up such jobs so that they can juggle family responsibilities and paid work. And that because of gender norms and gender socialization, that perhaps overall men are not expected in the same way to make these kinds of sacrifices and adjustments, that there's an assumption that women will be sacrificing their career trajectories and be disrupted because of their commitment to their children and family life, whereas men are not seen to be or assumed to be taking those kinds of sacrifices. And interestingly, when you look at the patterns of housework and childcare, there's a stark difference. So full-time workers, 19% of women compared to 8% of men are doing 15 hours of domestic work each week. So that's very interesting. And again, you can watch this little video another time, but it's an interesting analysis and examination of why it is that women are doing both full-time work and also more housework than men. So let's think about this concept of masculinities. What does this mean? In particular, Raywin Connell has established this kind of field of masculinity studies, and now this is a thriving field of sociology and very interesting. And it's that the idea that masculinities is plural rather than singular is that there's a range of different forms and expressions of masculinity at any time, at any particular place. And that's always subject to change. It's fluid. But that although there's lots of different, a whole range of expressions of masculinity, that there are some that we can see that have dominance in particular social contexts because they're embedded in those wider social institutions such as the state, such as education, such as the family, such as the workforce, and so on. Studying masculinities helps us to look at the ways that gender is being represented, and it doesn't look at so much kind of individual personality and behavior, but it's more about how is masculinity being represented and how does that relate to the different kinds of expressions of gender that are available to boys and men. So this concept of hegemonic masculinity is important because it's not that it's fixed, that dominant masculinity is something that's fixed. It's actually something that is social. It's not just an individual man acting in a dominant way, but it's the way that these forms of masculinity become institutionalized in the very social structures in such a way that they become almost naturalized, but also that then reproduce gender inequalities, the gender order, and perhaps in favor of men in general. But it's important to say that men are differently positioned, and they do not all directly benefit from hegemonic masculinity. So, it's understanding that inequalities are fluid and dynamic. They're not just fixed and static. And the difference between hegemony and dominance is that idea that things are not only achieved through force, but they're achieved more subtly through more subtle power relations, and the ways in which different representations come to bear on what we perceive as being kind of normalized, but are actually socially constructed. So here's some examples of hegemonic masculinities in different contexts and in different places, and you might recognize some of these. So it's not that all men take up these forms of hegemonic masculinity, but it's that we are confronted by these kinds of images all the time, every day, in our everyday kind of encounters with the media, with the news, with what it means to be a politician, what it means to be a soldier, what it means to be an athlete, and so on. And those seep into our understanding of what hegemonic masculinity is. However, it's important to remember that hegemonic masculinity is not fixed, it's not static, and it can be contested over. And so if you're occupying a position of relative power as a man, or even as a woman, because remember, women can take up masculinities as well, you can also contest those. And they can be contested within different organizations, or through social movements and so on. And it's important to remember that very few men actually occupy hegemonic positions that are celebrated in a particular culture at a particular time, but they hold a particular resonance in our imaginations about what masculinity might be. And they also, through these kind of symbols and ideals of hegemonic masculinity, men are not only organized hierarchically in relation to women, but also in relation to each other. And that's a really important insight of masculinity studies, is that men are differently positioned too. So unlike the earlier conflict theory, which is a very crude analysis that men as a group are dominant and women as a group are subordinated, this understands that there's fluidity and there's differences between men and women. And this again relates to heteronormativity, the ways that socialization is not only about gender, but it's also about heterosexuality, and that affects different men in different ways in terms of their relationship to hegemonic masculinity. Connell argues that all men in some way receive some measure of the what he calls or she calls the patriarchal dividend, even if they are implicitly excluded from the ideals of hegemonic masculinity. So although some men may be in a position of disadvantage in relation to hegemonic masculinity, they might be in a position of advantage in relation to women who are occupying positions of disadvantage, for example. So the modern gender order is based on this notion of patriarchal dividend, in which women remain subordinate to men overall. So that's not to say that women never have power, or that men always dominate women. It's much more subtle than that. But this notion of patriarchy is important because it's structured in our institutions. So, for example, if you look across the patterns around the gender division of labor, men collectively receive the bulk of income and also occupy the highest positions overall. Worldwide, men hold 9 out of 10 cabinet-level positions, nearly as many of the parliamentary seats, and most top positions in international agencies. So, there's a pattern here. So that doesn't mean that individual men all occupy these positions of power, but it means that overall there's a gender order that shows that gender inequality is reproduced over generations and is still apparent in the patterns in our society. And men also receive the benefits of a great deal of unpaid household labor, as we've seen in terms of domestic work, and also emotional support from women in the case of heterosexual relationships. So there's those inequalities as well. Some of them are more explicit in terms of wealth and power, and some of them are more subtle or implicit in terms of the different kinds of labor that different people take up. So patriarchy is a very important concept. And again, it's about social structures. It's not about individuals. It's about the way that these things are institutionalized. But, overall, there's a pattern that benefits men, but it doesn't always act in the interests of all men. So it's really important to think that sociology is not about individuals. It's about wider social symbols, language, patterns, structures, and how those structure our experiences in everyday life. So some women may gain power in a patriarchal system, and that might be through their association with or inheritance from powerful males, as we know very well from this image. But while it is a useful concept, patriarchy has also been challenged because it's really important to understand that patriarchy is not the only force and structure in place. And patriarchy, we might think, it's acting as an intersecting force with other oppressive forces, such as, for example, colonialism or neo-colonialism as an example, or racism. Okay, I will stop there and continue with part 4 in just a moment.